Hello, listeners. This is NGO Soul and Strategy. And as you know, I am fond of learning more about innovation. How can we spur a more innovation friendly climate in both nonprofits and NGOs and in other forms of public sector organization? And I've been intrigued by this topic, by innovation readiness, for a long time. And we have had several innovation coaches, leaders who have aimed to create innovation friendly climates in their NGOs and public organizations, etc., on this podcast before. And one commonly held belief I find is that innovation is harder to achieve in large, highly bureaucratic, and hierarchical organizations. But is that the case? Are there extra challenges in those cases? Or are there instead also extra opportunities and assets in these scenarios that we can put to work? Who better to ask than somebody who is an innovation specialist at UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, a large development focused agency within the United Nations? So in comes Soren Vester Haldrup, who I am happy to interview for the podcast. Welcome, Soren.
Thank you. Happy to be on the podcast.
I'm psyched to see what you are going to share with us. So, Soren is currently an innovation specialist and fund manager at UNDP, and we'll have to hear a little bit from you about the fund that is part of your role. He is also a board member at Global Integrity. He was a senior consultant at Oxford Policy Management, as well as before he was also at UNDP as a policy analyst and has had additional roles. But today I want to interview Soren about how he and those who are with him on this in UNDP, how they try to spur innovation. So Soren, in the first place, how did you get into this field of innovation within the UN system? Was that something random or was it very targeted?
I sort of stumbled into it. I rejoined UNDP a few years ago in a role as innovation specialist and project manager or manager for this innovation facility in UNDP. I had done a bit of work on innovation before, sort of mainly on the more kind of techie side, but not a lot. And I joined the organization at a really interesting time where
Mm.
the way that UNDP has shifted its approach to innovation has been really interesting. And I joined at a time where we were sort of transitioning from doing a lot of small scale experiments,
Mm.
what we call sort of single point solutions, interesting fixes where you can use innovation, whether that's technology or behavioral insights to do something new. Transitioning from that towards looking at how we can radically rethink how we understand and tackle really complex problems. So
Mm.
moving the focus of innovation from these smaller scale experiments towards supporting systems transformation. And
Mm.
that's what I've been doing here, or working on with my colleagues the last couple of years.
Okay, so we're going to. That's really important that you said that right away. And as I told you, Soren, before, I'm not really. I don't have a lot of expertise on systems work. We all know it's highly sought in the development sector. Lots of people talk about it. Sometimes I get a little skeptical about it. Sounds very intellectual, it sounds very grand, and I'm thinking, can we really, as human beings, even um, neuro wise, can we even grapple with that, let alone do something practical? But you're going to tell us about that. But that's a really important introduction. Um, why don't you tell us a little bit more about that shift? Why UNDP made that shift from focusing on small scale innovations to the aspiration to really seek innovation at a much bigger scale, at a systems scale. And explain to our listeners so that we're all on the same page. What do you mean by systems scale changes and innovation?
I'll certainly try. It is, I completely agree with you, a field or an area of work that also often has a lot of jargon. There's a lot of
Yes.
difficult language, and it's
Yes.
hard to figure out what does this
Abstract.
actually look like in practice.
Yeah.
So let me have a shot at it. The rationale for making the shift was, you know, basically that the world is facing some really thorny, complex problems that we aren't necessarily making a lot of progress on, and that requires bigger shifts in how we work and how the world works than more incremental type of work and traditional, very linear, project-based modes of sort of affecting change. When it comes to innovation, innovation tends to often be driven a lot by particular interesting solutions where you go out and look for a problem. And
Mm.
innovation in the more traditional sense might not necessarily help you tackle really complex problems because it might be focused on a particular type of fix that's focused on a specific kind of soft problem. So there was this realization that incremental small scale innovation is important, but it isn't necessarily helping us figure out how to understand to tackle really thorny complex problems. A different way of thinking about innovation is needed there. For instance, more traditional, often design thinking, Silicon Valley based ways of approaching innovation is this idea of a funnel. You begin to do many different things,
Yeah.
you fail fast, you get rid of the things that don't work, and then you end up with this one thing there's one solution that you scale, and that becomes the new iPhone or what have you.
Yeah.
That can be a good way of doing innovation for certain types of problems, but it isn't necessarily helpful if you work on complex problems where it's not just one solution you find and scale. You need to do many different things that you iterate, adapt over time as you learn, and in combination, maybe these many different things contribute to some sort of change out there. So
Mm.
it's a different logic of thinking about how we work and how we support change.
So this is about what some people, for instance, academia call wicked issues, so issues that are multifaceted, highly complex and interdependent, and where you need a multitude of actors to collectively, in some with some synchronization of intervention and measuring whether something is actually being shifted, we need to engage with a very big issue, like, let's say, certain types of very tenacious forms of poverty or climate change and many other things like that. Is that what we should be?
Exactly. Exactly. You said it perfectly. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So, apart, what I'd like to do in this conversation is stay focused on the how to nurture innovation in organizations, right? Because that's the podcast is focused on the organization as the unit of analysis, just as my work is. So let's start with a big question right away. How does one go about innovation in large bureaucratic organizations such as the UN? Because so often, in daily parlance, we think, oh, we need to be flat organizations and very unhierarchical.
It's a good question, and I'm not sure I have the perfect answer for it. We're definitely still learning a lot. I think the first aspect of this is to recognize that it is not easy. Big, large bureaucratic organizations take a long time to change, and there's a lot of inertia. Um, I think a useful starting point is also to think about many different efforts being needed to support some sort of change. So you need to be able to sort of you know play on different tangents and in a way on the piano. I think first of all, beginning to have a conversation about why is the status quo or the current way of doing business not necessarily useful? Why is it not working? Nurture this realization and interest in doing something different.
So that's the urge, what some change managers call the urgency, seeking a shared urgency for change.
Exactly. And I think, being able to link that up to also bigger existential questions is important. Like, if we are to remain relevant as an organization and to continue to be able to support low and middle income countries and fragile states around the world and tackling these big challenges that they're facing, we need to do things differently. Another aspect I think is very important, I guess, in any context, but not least in big, large organizations, is to have support and buy-in from the top, from the leadership in the organization, but also to nurture and bring up all the interest in change that is happening in the grassroots levels. UNDP, for instance, is a global organization. It's quite federalized. There are many different country offices around the world, so you need to play at these different sort of parts of the piano, both the leadership, top level strategy, people that work out in country offices and leadership in that place, and everything in between. What we try to do, and what seems to be working, is to begin to identify certain pockets where we can try things out to showcase how a different way of working is possible for the rest of the organization.
You use the word pockets.
Yeah, pockets,
Tell me
or
more.
there's a literature around islands of change, or islands of effectiveness, or what have you. But I think it is useful to think through how can we begin to identify certain areas where there is interest, where there are some leaders in a country office, or middle level managers that are interested in change, where there are some of the capabilities that are needed, to begin to support those pockets, use those as what we call deep demonstrations, to showcase to the rest of the organization that there is a different way of working, a different way of working is possible, but also to learn from that experience about all the internal organizational bottlenecks and software structures and project management systems and whatnot that might be preventing sort of a shift.
Yeah.
To use these demonstrations to showcase to the rest of the organization, to build the capabilities in these pockets of beginning to scale or expand that. And lastly, to have conversations with people and organizations outside of UNDP that we are accountable to, that we work with, that fund us, to begin to nurture that external demand for a different way of working, so that you can point to that and say, we want to be able to respond to this demand. And by doing these things differently, we are able to respond to that demand.
You're overtly, as one of your strengths, provoking that demand from peers, from primary constituents, and from funders. Yes. And is this an approach that you found has so far has some legs? You read a lot about that the either that scaling up of innovations almost never really happens, right? Whether it works is a second question, but it doesn't really happen. And so in other words, it's not linear, and it's not obvious that even once a good innovation has been, iterated, tested, validated, etc., that doesn't mean that there is a breakthrough to much greater scale, right? Is that something that you have observations on in the UNDP as a system?
Yes, and I think, coming back to a point I made earlier around, we are not trying to think of it as particular things, particular innovations that we scale. We actually try to avoid the phrase or the word scale, but to think about ripples of change or transformation, or other ways of doing it. But I think some people, when they talk about scale, talk about how you design for scale to begin with, rather than designing some small level intervention and then you try to find out how can it scale later on. I think you need to think about the bigger change to begin with. And I think scaling sometimes suggests this idea of one thing that you just do more of, or you just expand. And I think, at least our experience when it comes to supporting change in a very big organization is that it's not just one solution you develop and scale. It's many different things that you try to do to for these things in combination to hopefully
Right.
contribute to a shift in the organization.
Interesting. So it's only, yeah, and that it's only interaction amongst a number, and that is that systems perspective. Kind of, I'm just kind of trying a thought out here. Yeah. So you say it's not easy, obviously, but how many years of experience does UNDP have in this new way of seeking innovation? And can you point us to a concrete example of something that where you do think this approach has proven to work so far?
Yeah, so UNDP made this shift in its approach to innovation, beginning to talk about strategic innovation rather than more sort of tactical level incremental innovation. Made the shift in 2019. So right before COVID hit, and I think COVID definitely helped sort of strengthen the sense of urgency and a need for us to rethink how we work as an organization. So we've been at this for a few years, where we are practically working, supporting different so-called country offices, UNDP country offices in different countries, to help them figure out how to begin to work in these new ways, to adopt system thinking, design portfolios, and we are then using those experiences, those deep demonstrations, to as sort of leverage points for change in the wider organization. A practical example of this, there are a few where really interesting progress has been made. We have a Medium site or Medium blog where we blog about these types of experiences, and people can sort of look at that for more in-depth examples. But I think one example at a country level is our colleagues in Serbia, UNDP in Serbia, that began to rethink the issue of depopulation that the country is facing, away from just being a question of people need to have more babies, and that's how you solve it, toward beginning to work with government to re-envision how do we tackle this issue of depopulation in a much more holistic way. And I think that has led to some interesting changes. As an organization-wide level, I think an interesting aspect of or evidence of this type of shift is also UNDP's new strategic plan, which came out in January this year, which has quite a strong focus on working with the deeper structural, systemic aspects of development and tackling those deep, thorny issues, and doing that using these systems approaches. We talk about portfolio approaches, where you try to tackle the issue through a variety of interventions that are synergetic, that learn from each other, that you adapt over time, rather than standalone projects. And I think the shift in the narrative and focus in the strategic plan, I think, is again an example of how these things are resonate with people, and how it seems to be, at least for now, something the organization is interested in pursuing.
Interesting. So, in general, in your experience, does organizational size as well as structure matter when it comes to creating a good climate for innovation, or not necessarily?
I think it definitely matters. I think you can probably find climates that are conducive for or not conducive for innovation in small and big organizations. I think large organizations definitely present certain challenges simply by having more people. There are probably more divisions or teams, or you're spread across countries and what have you. And I think size definitely makes a difference in that connection, poses some particular challenges. I think there's also, at least specifically for UNDP, an aspect of how centralized or decentralized an organization is. You can have big organizations that might have very flat organizational structure, or big organizations that have a much more centralized one. And UNDP is quite decentralized or federalized, in the sense that at different country offices, there are they have a lot of autonomy to pursue, their work, because UNDP is its mandate is to support governments and communities in these countries to develop. So, whatever the priorities are in that country is something that, the country office will then work on. And that means a lot of different ways of working, a lot of different focus areas, and a lot of autonomy. And that definitely presents some challenges as well as opportunities for innovating. On the challenge side is of course that you can't just tell everyone what to do, or the center or the head of the organization doesn't necessarily have the ability to just direct everything. You do have a lot of autonomy. But I think on the opportunity side, it means that there are these many different pockets where you can begin to experiment, like microcosms in a way. We can begin to try to do things differently and learn about what works and doesn't when it comes to the shift towards portfolios and systems approaches, and point to these experiences and use those as leverage points for the rest of the organization. So I think there are opportunities as well as challenges.
Let me try the thought. Human inertia. Is it there's no link between greater human inertia and large, at least bureaucratic organization, whether they are decentralized or centralized? Is human inertia more kind of either provoked or triggered or more condoned in large organizations like the UN compared to small ones? We always have this idea that small is nimble and agile and so on. How does human inertia get impacted, you think, if at all? I'm just trying out a thought experiment.
It's a really good question. I think off the cuff, I assume and I think that there might be a lot more inertia in big organizations, simply because, first of all, big organizations might have been around for longer. So you have more of these, built-in ways of working and narratives and culture, and smaller organizations might not have been around for as long. It's not necessarily the case, but I think there's an aspect of that. I think a different aspect is also just the number of people and parts of an organization that you need to convince and support and change and enable is just bigger, larger in big organizations.
Even if they're heavily decentralized as UNDP is, you tell us. So even then, you still, the number of people that you need to get on your side, formally or informally, get approval from blah, 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 is still more extensive.
Yeah. And I would also, I guess the flip side might be that, in small groups and small organizations, you might also be very vulnerable to groupthink. Like you might all be on the same page, and then you just kind of keep doing things in that way, and there isn't necessarily a lot of scope for someone to sort of raise their hand and say, let's try to do something differently. Whereas if you have a big organization, there might be a lot more opportunities for like pockets to begin to sort of do things differently, because they do have more autonomy. And I think that's, that might be a, sort of a flip side of it.
Yeah. I learned a whole lot of things from an innovation coach, Soren Vester, who works in Board of Innovation, which is primarily innovation coaching and innovation strategy support rendering for private sector organizations. But Soren has worked in the UN and in a few nonprofits as well. And so one of the leadership mindsets that, in a separate podcast that we can link to in the show notes, he told me about is that he sees in public and UN and nonprofit organizations quite often a leadership mindset that he characterizes as an overconfidence of leaders' ability to project into the future, and a difficulty in staying focused on the desirability and the viability of an innovation, not getting bogged down too early in feasibility and compliance issues. Can you respond to that? And after that, I'll throw a couple more of these kind of variables because I'm curious
Hmm.
how they play out in the UN for you.
I think first of all, on leadership, as I said earlier on, I think leadership is really key to carve out the space for this way of working, to provide a vision, to shelter people that are trying to innovate and kind of encourage risk taking and all of these things. But I also think a something we're working with is humility and uncertainty. Like you need to be humble in the context of rapid change. You don't necessarily know how to solve these really big complex problems. There's a lot of change, not least in these times. And you need to approach this also as a leader with humility. And it's a different way of, it might be uncomfortable to certain leaders that feel that they need to know it all
Yeah,
and need to provide when sort of espouses this you know aura of I'm in charge, I know what's going on, I have a plan, and recognizing that we don't necessarily know what's going to happen, we don't necessarily have a plan, but we have a plan for how we're going to learn and adapt and continue to kind of move closer and closer to achieve the things that we want to achieve. And I think that presents some challenges for certain leaders. And I think it's a different set of capabilities that at least certain types of leaders in certain types of sectors or organizations
and
might
certain
not
types of
necessarily be
cultures.
trained in. Yeah,
Would you say also in certain types of cultures that
absolutely.
that humility and as well as not feeling that you have to know it all and um, being comfortable with uncertainty, which is hard psychologically for everybody, but is harder than in some other cultures. Do you see that? Because the UN is a global
Hmm.
organization, UNDP is. So do you see that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think within any particular country, whether that's the US or Tanzania or what have you, I think there are different organizations can have different organizational cultures. There can be certain sort of ideals about what leadership is and whatnot. But different cultures might also have more hierarchical or kind of organizational structures and ways of working and ideals of what
Ways of thinking.
leadership is. Certain bureaucracies, in certain countries, also much more hierarchical. Information kind of orders flow down and information kind of doesn't necessarily flow up. So
Right.
there are definitely many different sort of, this looks very differently in different types of countries, but also just in different types of organizations
True.
and sectors.
Yeah. Yeah. It
And
makes
I
sense.
think an aspect of this is probably also things around definitely power around gender and so on, like other certain like norms, masculine norms for like this like CEO masculine guy that knows all of it and just sets a direction and always have an answer versus something that's maybe not as sort of this alpha macho type leader.
Yeah. Yeah. So you also manage a fund that is, you indicated early in the interview, is an innovation promoting fund. Tell us a little bit more about it. And then particularly, I'm interested. One will often hear lack of innovation funds, also obstacles, and I'm thinking particularly of nonprofits now, obstacles in using cash reserves, unrestricted income, etc., are often being posed as a big constraint. Is that lack of innovation funding as big an issue as those voices make it out to be? Or is it more about having access to flexible money that can be shifted around as new priorities or incubated projects show some promise, need to go to the next decision gate, and need to be getting a new infusion?
Hmm. Really good question. To start with the innovation fund, so I'm managing UNDP's innovation facility, which is this innovation fund, which is maybe the main vehicle through which we are supporting this type of change and innovation in UNDP. So through that innovation fund, we are supporting financially and with technical advice and so on. different parts of UNDP, for instance, our colleagues in Serbia, to experiment with new ways of working and so on. So the funding we provide is a bit more risk-willing capital, if you will, that is specifically focused on helping, experiment with systems approaches and portfolios and so on. I think, to your point, I think one aspect of the challenge when it comes to funds and funding is resources. But I agree, which I think was sort of implicit in your question, that a lot of this is also to do not only with the money, but the funding arrangements around it. Having the flexibility to be able to shuffle things around, rethinking accountability metrics for how do you report to whoever has given you money. If you are required to plan everything up front and define baseline and key performance indicators, and you must report on these, and that doesn't give you a lot of flexibility to do things differently. No. So this is actually a different area of work for us, where as part of helping UNDP make the shift towards more holistic systems informed approaches, we are working on the question of funding. How do we help collectively people that work in organizations that work in international development, not least funders, rethink funding arrangements? Can we pool funding, different types of funding, in some sort of more flexible systemic funding vehicle? What would that look like? How do we rethink accountability reporting metrics when it comes to funding? Can we create a stronger focus on learning rather than accountability for delivering whatever you said you would deliver? How do we build these types of things into funding vehicles and funding arrangements? I think is really important.
That's interesting. And accountability focused on learning, and learning that actually is shared then, right? So it's used by the organization, and because that's also from a knowledge management perspective often is an obstacle. Yeah. Let me mention, before we have to bring this to a close, let me mention a couple of other factors that have been mentioned to me by other innovation coaches. One is an over-reliance on in-house production of solutions versus simply buying things off the shelf. Now, I know you're not looking for single products or service, you're looking from a systems perspective to that portfolio for larger scale system level issues, but still, do you see that show up at all in UNDP or not?
Absolutely. I think it's something that is, whether we call it innovation or anything else, I think people are just in general keen on, having something that is their own. And we want to develop this. We are unique in all sorts of ways, and we need something that is very unique, and often, we might not necessarily need that, and you can get something that's sort of off the shelf, or that's already, you can build on things that are already there and so on. And I think there's a different, maybe a different aspect of this issue as well, around to what extent we think that we can develop solutions and know the solutions ourselves as just one organization that work on some big complex issue that involves a lot of different actors, and we are definitely not the most influential ones in shaping, how certain countries, the development trajectories and what have you. So I think there's an aspect of thinking beyond us coming up with solutions towards how can we support and enable and work with others to collectively come up with ways of tackling some of these
wherever it originates, in other words.
Exactly. And it's not necessarily solutions that we will own, but we are, we kind of working collectively in this wider ecosystem with other actors, where we try to collectively come up with ways of tackling these things. It is not something that we will just do and we will just own and we alone will contribute to these big changes. That's not how the world works. It might be possible if it's a very confined, more simple problem, but if it's some of these really big, thorny, complex ones, we're only going to play one small role in it, and we definitely won't have all the solutions ourselves.
And so that then links back to contribution versus attribution, and kind of holding back on an impetus to plant your flag, if you will, right? That
Exactly.
we see that
Exactly.
in the NGO world as well. It's a very seductive thing. Um, one more, and then I want to move to another question and then bring it to an end. Um, I find NGOs, particularly mid to large size ones, but not only, quite process oriented and not that outcome oriented. I could imagine, and it's been a long time since I worked in, not in UNDP, but in another small part of the UN system. Uh, um, but that is also the case in, no matter how decentralized UNDP is, but that it could be quite process oriented, and not outcome oriented. Is that an obstacle for pursuing innovation or not necessarily?
That is a good question. I would say some focus on process is definitely useful, because I think a lot of aspects of how we need to innovate and do things differently is around the processes whereby we do business and how we work. Um, However, this is all linked to outcomes. Like we need to be focused on, achieving or supporting the type of changes that we want to support, and changes in processes are focused on helping us do that and helping others achieve the types of development objectives that they are aiming towards. So I think both are needed. I think one aspect of the outcome orientation that we and many other organizations are grappling with is, how do we know, how do we look at outcomes and not just look at like activity level progress metrics and immediate outputs? How do we shift focus towards how this in the aggregate adds up to something that is bigger? Which means that when it comes to reporting and monitoring and evaluation, for instance, you need to shift from looking at individual interventions or efforts in isolation towards looking at how these in combination might be contributing to some sort of higher level change. And you need to think about how you are part of a bigger story of change. Like you said, look for contribution rather than attribution, and recognize that the more outcome and impact focused you are, the more this is a story about how you are part of the bigger whole. It is not about you alone. And I think that is an important shift. The issue is that, or one of the many issues is that a lot of the accountability structures, reporting, how funding is structured, and all of that
Exactly.
is very focused on, we need to have some very tangible progress metrics, and they need to be aggregatable, and ideally they need to be numbers that you can like add
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
And that's definitely not helping. But even with very flexible funding and so on, it is still very difficult for an organization to make that shift towards focusing on higher level outcomes.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. So one last thing that I'm confused by is, sometimes I hear mixed messages about innovation in the following way. Some people say, many innovations are really tweaks on how we do things. Others say, no, no, innovation is about big breakthroughs. So, as a lay person, how should I understand that? Is it and? Is it that we like to think it's about big breakthroughs, but actually a lot of useful innovation comes from simply tweaking what we did before? I'm confused.
I would say it's all of the above. I think different types of innovation are useful and needed, and it's not an either or. I think incremental day-to-day innovation, tweaking small things that help you as an organization work better or save money, or achieve your results in a to a greater extent. Those are important and those are necessary. However, only focusing on very incremental, immediate type of innovation might not necessarily help you overcome really big, complex problems or challenges that you are facing as an organization, or challenges that you are trying to tackle as an organization. And I think having that shift on also looking at the macro strategic systems level is something that is useful. And UNDP shift towards also having this systemic focus means that it's not like the organization is also doing the more day-to-day incremental type of innovation and trying out new technologies and what have you. That is still happening, but it is supplemented with also working with innovation in a different way that's much more focused on the strategic level, the transformation.
Okay, so it is all of the above, as you said. So now I'm curious, what gives you, Soren, the biggest source of satisfaction on a daily basis in your job?
I would say there are a few different aspects of it. On the more personal level, first of all, there's an opportunity to work with many different interesting people from around the world. And that diversity and different types of input really,
Yeah,
drives me intellectually.
obvious. Yeah.
And then there's an aspect of, even though it can be very frustrating and hard to see progress and at times depressing and what have you, I think still being focused on how can we tackle some of these really big challenges that the world is facing is something that gets me up in the morning. Those challenges are very difficult to tackle, and you kind of have to kind of break things into smaller kind of milestones in a way that, okay, at least we managed to change this thing, which plays one small role in a bigger story of change. But I think having that focus on the big impact, and that is what we're working towards, is something that drives me and motivates
That is
me.
motivating. Okay. Yeah, got it. Well, thank you so much, Soren. This has been, I've learned yet more about innovations in what I like to call organizations as animals, if you will. So, where should people go if they want to know more about how you do your craft, and where should they go to find more about you?
People can go to my LinkedIn or my Twitter to find more. I am regularly posting things about what we're up to.
Okay.
My team in UNDP, we also have a website that has a lot more information about how we work, who we work with, and people can also visit that.
Good at, and I'll ask you to send it to me. And you also mentioned in the beginning a blog on Medium where you track,
Yes.
right?
So on Medium, we are in general, we try to do what we call learn out loud through the process. So immediate sort of, what we're learning while we're still in it, telling the stories not only about what is working well, but the challenges we are facing and so on, and sharing that with others. So we
Yeah.
have a Medium blog where there's a steady stream of pieces that describe what we do.
Excellent. We are going to link to all of what you just said so that our listeners have access to that. Well, thank you so much, Soren, once again, for all your insights. Thank you for teaching me and teaching our audience. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast stimulating, then be sure to check out the other episodes in my podcast, where you will find several other episodes that are focused on innovation, interviews with innovation coaches, managers, and leaders in INGOs and in public organizations. And you can find many of those not just on my website, fiveoaksconsulting.org with the number 5, but also on my YouTube channel. Subscribe to my email list, and you'll always be the first to know what is being dropped next. So, this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO, Soul, and Strategy.